Nitish, shall we start? It's 8 o'clock. I mean, 11 o'clock yours.
Yes, sir, we should start.
Good morning, gentlemen. And if there are any ladies, good morning to ladies, gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar on the Chinese who are building a dam on Brahmaputra called Yarlung, as they call it on their side. It's going to be a game changer in a way. It's going to be one of the biggest dam in the world. As it is, when they did the Three Gorges, it was said that the Earth rotation had changed by about 0.02 milliseconds. So this is going to be even bigger than that. And naturally, as an upper riparian state, they have some responsibilities to give water to not only India, but also to Brahmaputra, to Bangladesh. But as yet, they have not really committed. Though some encouraging news is that when our foreign secretary visited China, and in the yesterday's handout, there is that they will give some data and maybe also water sharing, etc. But India is also trying to make a dam in Arunachal, as just in case that because we require a lot of irrigation in Assam. I think to throw light on all this, we have two very eminent speakers. One is Dr. Uttam Sinha from IDSA, who earlier we had heard during the Indus Water Treaty. And he's got a book, which of course he had even briefed the PMO on that. And then, of course, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, who was, as you know, the first man on the Siachen when we captured Siachen from Pakis, or their intentions to capture it. So we have both these stalwarts with us. And welcome to all of you. I'll hand over to Shishir Mahajan to give further introduction of both the speakers and continue with the webinar. I'm speaking from South Africa, so all of you to good morning. Over to Shishir. Can you hear me, sir? Artanka, sir, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
I can't hear. Dr. Uttam Sinha, may I request you to start? We'll not get into the formalities. I think, so you could please start.
Thank you. Thank you, Air Marshal Gokhale, for the introduction. I mean, this lecture has come about because of our concern over what China is planning to do, intending to build this gigantic 60 gigawatt super dam on the Yarlung Brahmaputra. We call it the Brahmaputra. It's the Yarlung that flows through Tibet before it reaches us. At the cost of 137 billion, then that's quite phenomenal if you see the price that has been attached to such a project. And it's almost 2.5 times the electric production of the Three Gorges. So I think this gigantic scale, this huge project is obviously, in many sense, creating a whole lot of questions. The first question, I think, is whether the Chinese will actually do it or not. The second question is, if they do it, what are the kind of repercussions that India will have to face? We do not know anything about the blueprint. We sort of have a rough idea what the Chinese plan to do. And this plan is nothing really new. I hope you can all hear me. Am I okay?
Yeah. No problem, sir.
So this plan is not really new. In fact, in 2010, when I was traveling to the United States, and I had written a 2-piece editorial in the Washington Post called Tibet's Watershed Challenge. And it sort of drew attention to what the Chinese were planning to do, simply because the Chinese needed a lot of water in their economic zone, which was north and east part of their country, where in any case they have less amount of water. So I think one of the objectives of these kind of projects is to keep countries guessing, particularly India, lower riparian, keep them guessing, keep them worried, keep them tense. There is some background noise coming. I hope it's not from my side.
No, from somewhere else, but we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I think one of the prime objectives that the Chinese, when they build such kind of projects, is to obviously keep you guessing, because you have very limited information regarding what they're doing. And lower riparians tend to get concerned, worried, and they become tense. So I think the first objective of this super dam project is that India is naturally quite worried as to the outcome of this project. If you look at the location of this project, as we sort of gather through various sources, including satellite monitoring, it is in probably the most remotest and inhospitable part of the world. You know, it's hidden amidst steep mountains and gorges that make accessibility hugely difficult. So even if the Chinese are planning to eventually build this dam, I think there would be extreme challenges that they might have to encounter. Of course, they've built the railways, they've built the roadways, but to get this thing going, I have some elements of doubt whether they would really eventually be successful in doing it, because of the accessibility, because of the cost of the project, etc. Also, in terms of risk, and this is a big factor that we need to consider, especially when we are looking at China, is the region is highly seismic. And if you look at the geologists' reports on that region, it's called the Indo-Sanko Suture, and it is a highly unstable area. And we've seen frequent earthquakes in that part of the region. In fact, just before the Chinese announced this mega project, a powerful 7.1 magnitude earthquake with its epicenter, which was about 150 kilometers away from the project site. So, you know, this kind of concern, this kind of huge risk is something that we'll have to really consider. And maybe a few more earthquakes and things can completely turn around. I mean, the Chinese, while they say it is a very safe project and that India need not be concerned about it, but I think such kind of events, earthquakes, landslides, the general geophysical changes that are happening might make the Chinese think otherwise. In the sense, the project that we are focusing on, the super dam, in terms of engineering impossibility, I know the Chinese are very good at scaling all the impossibilities. They built the biggest dam, the Three Gorges, they have the highest, railway track, the fastest train, etc. But I still feel that there is an element of impossibility in what they're planning to do on the super dam. The Brahmaputra, it takes a sharp U-bend around the Namcha Barua mountain and descends sharply before entering Arunachal Pradesh. Now, the rough plan of the Chinese is to simply use the descent, the fall of the Brahmaputra. And that fall is quite incredible, 300 meters to about 3,000 meters to about 6,000 meters. That fall of 2,400 meters is what the Chinese are planning to use in terms of producing electricity. Now, either they could do it by building a series of dams around the Namcha Barua, or dig a tunnel through the Namcha Barua, a tunnel of about 40 to 45 kilometers, and then use that fall from 3,000 meter to 2,400 meter, use that fall to produce and turn the turbines and produce these huge amount of electricity. The danger for us is the point where they're going to install these installations, these many small, medium size run-of-the-mill dams, is just about a little less than 30 kilometers from the Arunachal border. So India, in a sense, would be meeting a lot of water coming into its territory. This sudden rush of water is something that we need to get worried about if eventually the dam comes about. And remember, these waters are not silt-ridden water. These waters will be minus the silt, because these various dams on the Brahmaputra will hold back the silt. And this will be water which will be coming sharp into our territory. It will be cutting the water beds across it. And it's a water which has practically no use because it doesn't feed the fields. It doesn't have a high nutrient value. And therefore, it can, in many sense, damage our whole agricultural belt in the northeast part of the country. So I imagine, in a quick nutshell about the mega project, I would imagine that the Chinese, in some sense, are showcasing its engineering might and its sort of ambition and attempting this kind of an impossible task and creating thereby a lower riparian fear. And the fact that, this kind of a projection that they can do things that are impossible, in many sense, creates a lot of concern down riparian. So why is China so aggressive on the transboundary rivers? And I think we need to understand the Chinese mind, the Chinese strategic plan, and it is not something very new. I think the Chinese have been looking at strategizing water resources for a long, long time, ever since Mao came into the picture in 1951. And today, China is the second largest economy in the world. Its GDP in 2024 was about 19 trillion US dollar. And it was a 5% increase from the previous year. India's GDP in 2024 is about 3.8 trillion. So it's almost like 5.5 times more. And what we see is that China in the last 4 decades has invested heavily in infrastructure, in technology, in export-driven economy. And it has created a foundation that continues to pay dividends. And this economic power, this economic trajectory of China depends upon the availability of water resources in its sovereign territory. So I think that crucial link of water to its economic growth is quite intricate. I think as China plans its progress and its economic growth, more and more water would be required by them. In fact, the entire sector-wise allocation of water in China is changing. There's a great emphasis on the agricultural sector, which is about 60 to 65%. But by 2030, water in the agricultural sector will dramatically reduce to about 50%. And there'll be a dramatic increase for water in the industry and manufacturing sector. Currently it's about 20 to 22%. By 2030, it will rise to 32 to 34%. So this shift in water allocation, shifting from agriculture to more on manufacturing and industry, is something to look out for. And the Chinese would be far more aggressive in bringing out as much water as they can to strengthen this sector. Remember, the Chinese don't keep any water for environmental protection. They are utilizing maximum amount of water for the needs and requirements. Also, you must understand the distribution of water in China is quite varied. So the southern part, which is the Tibetan Autonomous Region, Sichuan and Yunnan provinces, have far more water and the territory is very limited. But on the north, in the northeast part, where water is required in great amount, they have very little. So it's about 19% of water in about 64% of the territory in the northeast. So this varied distribution of water in China has always made planners, the Chinese people, think what to do with this variation. And what they have done is exactly look at where the water resources are, the rich water resources of the Tibetan Plateau, and then shift the water up north and northeast where the water is required far more. So, and that's been the strategic planning for the last 75 years. Now, to understand India and China riparian position, I think it's important to know that there are 3 important rivers which enter India from the Tibetan Plateau. I mean, we are, of course, focusing a lot on the Brahmaputra, but there is a certain portion of the Indus that also flows from Tibet, almost 200 miles before entering into Ladakh. Right? We have to factor that bit also. Of course, the Chinese attention on the Indus is very, very limited. There is also the Satluj. A certain portion of the Satluj and some of its tributaries begin in the Tibetan plateau before it comes to India. So we have principally three rivers that we must note: the Indus, the Satluj, and of course the Brahmaputra. Now, the entry point of these rivers, the Indus in Ladakh, the Brahmaputra in Arunachal, add significant dimension to the border issue. So I think water and territory is crucially linked when it comes to India-China relationship. A few weeks back, I think you would notice that the army chief had said, that the LAC is stable but sensitive. I think it will remain sensitive because of one of these factors, the rivers entering into these sensitive border areas. So an important point, I think, to make is territory and water are therefore crucially linked to India and China relations. But the critical difference between the two countries is that China is far more water secure, while India receives a large portion of its water from outside its territory, and therefore it is water dependent. China is water independent, India is water dependent. And the hydrological equation thus gives China a huge strategic advantage that can be easily translated into political leverage and bargaining with India. If you were to study some of the facts that comes up in the Chinese Ministry of Water Resources, China shares about 50 major international rivers with 16 downstream riparian countries. Right? And it's interesting to note that the volume of the surface water flowing out of China is about 730 billion cubic meter annually. So that's the amount of water that is flowing from China into these 16 neighboring countries. And China, interestingly, and this is where China really becomes a hydro hegemon, China actually receives only 1% of water from outside its territory, which means if it is giving away 730 BCM, it is receiving only 7.3 BCM of water from outside. So this geographical, this natural sort of setting makes China a supremely hydrological powerful country, right? Because its dependency in water is very, very less from outside. Now, the water which China sends out to its neighboring country, India receives almost half of that river water that leaves the Tibetan plateau. Almost about 48 to 49% of the water comes to India from the Tibetan plateau. And this translates into almost 354 billion cubic of water flow in India annually from Tibet. And in the Brahmaputra in particular, the annual average flow is 78 BCM. So as you can see with these facts, that A, China is hydrologically supreme, B, India is dependent on the flow of the rivers from the Chinese side. And also, and it's not that just that the rivers come to India and that's it. The rivers that come to India also goes to our neighboring countries on the west and on the east. The Indus eventually goes to Pakistan and then to the Arabian Sea. And the Brahmaputra, which comes to us, also goes to Bangladesh and then into the Bay of Bengal. So there is an important emphasis that we must understand. And this emphasis is that India is actually a middle riparian country. Right? It receives a lot of water and then sees that that water is gone to its neighboring countries. And this, of course, is not legally defined. There's nothing called a middle riparian in the international riparian legal system. In the system, there's only an upper riparian and a lower riparian. There's nothing called a middle riparian. But I think this is an important emphasis when we deal with countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh to emphasize our middle riparian position. And this is to say that, well, look, as a lower riparian, we are concerned with what the Chinese is doing. But as an upper riparian, we follow the principle and responsibility to give away waters. So it becomes an important element of regional diplomacy. And I don't think we have really highlighted that in our neighborhood diplomacy the way we should have, our middle riparian position. But coming back to China itself, understand the Chinese mindset. The Chinese, always claim indisputable sovereignty over their waters. There is this concept of absolute sovereignty and the concept of limited sovereignty of water resources. The Chinese say that it's indisputable, our sovereignty, and the way we use the water is the way we like. And therefore, they haven't really engaged in any international convention, whether it's the 1992 Helsinki Water Convention or whether it's the 1997 United Nations Non-Navigational Watercourse Treaty. They've never been part of that because they consider water as an indisputable part of their sovereignty, right? And I think it's a hegemony, and this kind of a hydro hegemony is a kind of legacy that the Chinese have built into their planning process. It's a legacy of hydrological control of the rivers in their territories. Right? It gives them a certain status. It gives them a certain political supremacy, not only within their territory, but also a reflection of their actions amongst the 15 to 16 neighboring countries. If you look at the history of Chinese civilization, is in many ways a history of hydraulic engineering and canal building and water conservation. So they have this huge legacy, the legacy of knowledge, the legacy of understanding, and how to tame the rivers, how to control the rivers, how to manipulate the rivers. Right? And these elements have now become part of the regional strategy in dealing with lower riparian countries. So water in China is hugely strategic. It's political. It's a leverage. It's a bargaining chip. It's a combination of several things. And the Chinese leadership undoubtedly use water in dealing with its neighboring country. And Mao Zedong set this kind of pathway. And he was probably one of the most enigmatic personalities of the 20th century. He established the People's Republic of China in 1949, and he transformed it into a modern, industrialized, socialist state. And I've been reading some of Mao's literature, translated, of course, and he, way back in 1950, issued a directive, and it's very interesting because we're talking about 1950, and this directive is actually on the Huai River and how it should be harnessed. And, that talked about constructing new routes for the rivers that could lead to the sea in order to mitigate flooding. And if you read these scripts, it's quite audacious because these plans are so difficult to really achieve because you're actually encountering nature. You're actually trying to reverse the flow or change the flow path. It's audacious, but I think Mao's whole idea was to bring in a certain triumph of political mobilization. He would use these resources to mobilize political sort of sources and political sectors and try to overcome it. And his whole approach to nature was to conquer it. Nature is always seen as an enemy that has to be beaten and that has to be conquered. And I think this plan, the Maoist thinking, systematically came into the Chinese planning process. And he sort of built a hydraulic society with control of water supply for irrigation and controlling production. And thereby you had a society, you had an establishment which was a very powerful exploitative bureaucracy. So nature and resources became very much part of the Chinese administration. The hydraulic society and the control of it. So when Mao in 1949, when in 1950, I think he invaded Tibet, he looked at the natural resources of Tibet and said, they have so much of water and they don't require that amount of water. And he set this task of shifting water from Tibetan plateau to where it was required. So, it's something that we need to really factor in. And I think there is something interesting in our the way we dealt with the Tibetan question in 1954, for example. Mao was very clear about the importance and significance of Tibet, and it wasn't any emotional thing. It wasn't any sort of great emphasis on cultural aspect, but I think primarily and principally, it was about the rich natural resources that Tibet had. And Mao would often refer to Tibet as a British colony, and and he started to admire how he would acquire these territories, and he would also gloat over the great rivers that the Tibetan had, and therefore I think when we went in for the Panchsheel agreement, we did not really weigh the significance of Tibet's water. I haven't seen in any writing or in any study that showed that the Jawaharlal Nehru understood the natural rich resources of Tibet. And so when he signed the Principal Panchsheel Treaty, he in some certain sense forfeited the entire rich resources there and the kind of impact that it would have on our territory several decades later when the Chinese start building these infrastructures there. And I think Nehru, when he signed the Panchsheel, he came back to India and he said, the people of China do not want war. And of course he was proved gravely wrong. But I'm just trying to make this point that that the whole Chinese approach on rivers and waters are not a new phenomenon. It is a culmination of a systematic thinking which uses water as a strategic resource, and it's about control of these resources, and therefore it has become now a very important leverage, a very important weapon in the hands of the Chinese when they deal with lower riparian country. So before I really talk about our options and what we should do, we should know what kind of water arrangements India has with China. We don't have a treaty. We don't have a long-lasting treaty with China. China doesn't believe in any water treaty. It sort of believes in some kind of ad hoc arrangements, MOUs, technical cooperations. India, in contrast, has had water sharing agreements, the Indus Water, the Ganga Treaty. So that is an important contrast. I think India diplomacy is essentially to be responsible as an upper riparian, at times even be generous. We see that in the Indus waters. We see that also in the Ganga Treaty. Guaranteeing a certain volume of water to your lower riparian countries is a rare thing that countries do, especially upper riparian countries do in the international setting. But I think we've had a diplomacy of a different kind. We've had a vision of a different kind. Our DNA is very different from what the Chinese are. And therefore, there is no making judgments here that Indian diplomacy is bad or the Chinese diplomacy is good, etc. But this is the way I think India has formulated its riparian policy in the subcontinent. More dialogue-oriented, more cooperative sort of approach, elements of generosity, elements of concern, elements of responsibility. I think all this leads into India's regional water approach. But what we have with China is something that I guess is at best the most practical thing to happen. And that is an MOU of a certain period of time. Every 5 years, this MOU gets renewed. It first came about in 2002 on the Brahmaputra, hydrological data sharing and information related to water level, discharge, rainfall, etc. And there are specified stations on the Chinese side which send these data to us from, I think, 1st June to 15th October. This is the period of time, the monsoon flood season time. And these information are quite vital. We have also signed an MOU on the Satluj in 2005. Again, hydrological information in respect to flood season. And these are all 5 years sort of MOUs, which gets renewed, you know. Just recently, I think it's again got renewed. So it's more of a goodwill MOU. There's no permanency involved in this. It is not definitely a treaty. And there is an element of uncertainty behind it, because these MOUs might not get renewed at a certain point of time. If the political equation between India and China is not good at a certain point of time, the Chinese might not renew this MOU, and probably you'll be left high and dry, right? And I think you all would probably know that I think at the Doklam time, for a certain period of time, the Chinese withheld these informations, and I think we were quite worried about it. We also pay for this information. It's not that these data are given free to us. You know, India gives data to Pakistan cost-free. You know, it's part of the arrangement in the Indus Waters Treaty. But here, we are paying for these data. We're paying for the information that comes to us, and we pay, I think, in Chinese currency, about 900,000 US dollar, something like that, and it's converted into yuan. So, so you know, this it comes at a price. And everything and anything you do with the Chinese has a certain price attached to it. There is, of course, a lot of border standoff, as this region is the entry point of these rivers. So we need to be very concerned about that. Also, I think when India plans its responses, we need to factor all the elements that I've just said. We need to be far more versed with the hydrological fact. We have to have better satellite monitoring to know what is happening on the other side of the Brahmaputra, and can't truly and fully rely on the Chinese supply of data. We can trust those data because it's part of the MOU, but we need to constantly verify those data. So trust and verify is something that we need to constantly do. So in a few minutes, do I have about 5-10 minutes of time?
Yes, sir, you have.
Right. So in this 5 to 10 minutes, I think what I'll do is just focus on what India should be doing, and certainly not just as a reaction to what the Chinese are doing, but in any case, it should be our action plan on the rivers that are coming from the Tibetan side. And I think first and foremost, India has to be completely proactive in its water resource development and not reactive. It shouldn't be anything to do because the Chinese are doing this and therefore we should be doing that. I think it has to be a collective national water resource development policy in India, which factors right from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. You see, the difficult reality of China is that you can't change this position. The Chinese will always remain an upper riparian, and India will always remain a lower riparian. But it's not necessary to say that if India is a lower riparian, it is therefore at a disadvantageous position. And for that, we have to understand the factual content of the water itself. And the factual content shows that we are in a slightly favorable position, because the Brahmaputra, as it comes into India, is actually the Siang, and the Siang then meets several tributaries and then enters into Assam and then actually becomes the Brahmaputra. So the Brahmaputra has already gathered a lot of water inside India's territory. And I think this, for us, is a huge advantage, because really the Chinese can't do that much because it is on our side that we gather more water. And we have to factor this quite clearly into our strategic planning. I think one of the realities that we must understand is that water requires a very objective data analysis. Often what we read in the media are very loose statements that the Chinese are going to stop the flow of the water or they're going to flood it. If we understand the hydrological data and the facts, we know that there is a lot that we can do on our side, despite the fact that the Chinese can build the dams, etc. Right? I think informed science is a very good starting point for India to build its capability and capacity on the Brahmaputra. And I think when we do that, we should also de-emphasize China as a hydro hegemon. And I'll explain probably some of the reasons why I believe that we need to de-emphasize China here and concentrate more on our capabilities and capacities, right? We know that the length of, for example, the length of the Brahmaputra is about 2,800 kilometers, right? Of that, 1,600 to 1,650 kilometer flows through Tibet, right? And about 920 kilometer traverses India, and the rest 42 kilometers is in Bangladesh. Now, on the face of it, 56% of the river flows in the Chinese territory, right? About 1,625 kilometers. So it can be very easily mistaken that China controls a large share of the water, the volume. However, and this is a very important fact, the volumetrics of the Brahmaputra is not proportional to the length inside the country. So while the Chinese have a greater length of the Yarlung or the Brahmaputra, they don't have in terms of volume that much. Right? So when it comes to India, and it passes this what is called the Trans-Himalayan rain-fed section, the precipitation is far more higher in the Indian side, right? So the precipitation on the Chinese side would be about 300 mm annually, but on our side it's about 2,000 mm. So this difference we need to understand and calculate into our water planning process. India, therefore, I think, given what the situation is, and given that there is ample amount of water to develop, should have a greater amount of water development footprints in Arunachal in particular. Given the terrain of Arunachal Pradesh, it is quite suitable to have storage capacities. Now, this is something that India's planning process needs to inculcate very, very swiftly. Because if you're looking at an economy of 5 trillion and heading towards 2050 with a whole lot of economic returns, you have to use the water resources far more better than you have done so far. See, we have about 2,000 BCM of harvestable water in India, and we've just mapped this. The Jal Shakti Ministry has mapped this, the amount of water that we have. Out of the 2,000 BCM, only about 220 BCM is stored. Now, for an economy our size and the vision of our economic growth, the storage water is very, very less. And we need to focus on the storage capacity. Much of India's storage capacity is generally in the peninsula belt. Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, that's the belt where much of the water storage is. Surprisingly, if you look at the Himalayan belt, Kashmir, Arunachal Pradesh, the water storage is actually zero. And this is where your best sites are available. And I'm saying this despite the seismological challenges. The sites needs to be carefully selected. It need not be a mega project. We don't need to really follow the Chinese all the time. We need carefully located, scientifically proven water storage capacities, not only in Arunachal Pradesh, but also in Jammu and Kashmir, especially on the Chenab in particular. I think this government is focusing a lot of attention there to build the storage capacities. And this storage is quite critical for India's and its economic growth. So I think increasing the footprints in Arunachal, the water footprints in Arunachal, will be very useful for us. It also brings in greater integration into the border region, as an effective way to neutralize any Chinese claim in Arunachal Pradesh. The more you develop the border, the more infrastructure you have, the more electricity that the people have, the more comfort that they have, brings in a certain degree of integration into India's appeal. And I think that is an element that policymakers will have to really focus on. Expand the footprint. We've had certain projects coming up, the Subansiri in particular. Of course, there are a lot of concerns about big projects in India. It's not easy. The Chinese can pass through any projects. But here we have to encounter several levels of challenges. And at the ground level, at the local level, people resistance always high when it comes to such projects. And that also goes for the fact that Subansiri is facing a lot of farmer protest. But I think we need to deal with this. The government needs to deal with it because there is a significance and importance of storage capacities that we have to factor in. But we also need to negotiate and engage with local people's concern and try to come out with the best outcome. So that is something that we need to pay attention to. The second element, I think, in the Northeast and on the Brahmaputra would be inland navigation. And I think it's an important entry point to bolster basin level cooperation, harness the potential of the Brahmaputra basin. It also has major dividends. You see, when you have navigation ability, inland navigation ability, it brings in certain economic growth, it increases employment, it improves livelihood, and sort of binds the Northeast together through the rivers. And this is something we need to factor. We have the National Inland Navigation, which has been passed by the Parliament. The NW2 is the Brahmaputra, and there's a whole lot of attention focused on it. I think this attention needs to expand to the entire Northeast. There are 1,800 kilometers of potential waterways and navigation in the Northeast itself. And this, unfortunately, has been ignored and needs to be captured into our planning process when you're focusing on the Northeast. These waterways will also, give you critical economic corridors and access to Chittagong port in Bangladesh and the Haldia port in West Bengal. So there is a whole lot of connectivity that can happen as you develop inland navigation in the Northeast. And I think two quick points on how we should deal with China on the water issues diplomatically. The first thing is that we shouldn't shun away from dialogues with China, and we should bring water as a core issue in our dialogue process with China. The MOU that we have already needs to be upgraded. In fact, we should bring in China's mega dam into our discussion and try to see what can be done in terms of information sharing, in terms of the size, the capacity, etc. Remember when the Paruchu incident happened in 2005, which was a lake outburst in Tibet, and it had caused heavy destruction in Himachal Pradesh. That led to actually the MOU on the Sutlej River. So there is a precedent there that if there is a concern that India puts forward, these concerns can be translated into a sort of a platform where information can be shared. So I think Super Dam or the various dams that the Chinese are planning on the Yarlung should be put as part of the MOU. And I think this dialogue with the Chinese should continue, and our emphasis and our concern should also be brought in a much more calibrated sense. On the more diplomatic front, I think it's something that India should do is to build what is called a collective lower riparian concern. Remember, many are lower riparians vis-a-vis China. Nepal is, Bhutan is, Bangladesh is, so is Pakistan, but we can leave Pakistan aside for the time being. If we move eastward, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and the Southeast Asian country can form a good lower riparian belt where you collectively raise questions with China, make them far more responsible to their actions as an up riparian state. And collectively, I think the voice is a little more louder when it comes to dealing with China. But this is something that India can lead from the front in building a lower riparian coalition. Also, I think that BBIN and the BIMSTEC needs to be activated far more in terms of water resource management. This is something that needs to be brought in, and I think it's happening already in terms of commerce, in terms of connectivity, using rivers as lifelines, using rivers as economic returns in the sub-region. That's something that we can always do with our neighboring countries. As I said earlier, I think it's important for us to emphasize our middle riparian position and sort of change the perception in the neighborhood that India is a water hegemon. When you go to Bangladesh or Pakistan, you hear, India is the water aggressor, that India is a water hegemon. We haven't done enough to change this narrative. And I think that needs to be brought in more and more through the media, through writing, through various discussions, that India is actually a middle riparian, concerned with what China is doing, but also responsible in giving away waters to both Pakistan and Bangladesh. So that element, I think, needs to be brought in through a greater degree of hydro diplomacy in the region. Also, remember, we have what is called the Ganga-Mekong cooperation, and this is a very useful cooperation, which came about during Vajpayee's government time. And I think very recently, a few years ago, it's been reactivated. That brings in the Southeast Asian country and the South Asian country together in terms of looking at water and building cooperation and linking things together. So that is something that also we need to understand and raise the level of intra-regional cooperation between South Asia and Southeast Asian countries. So I think these are some sort of approach that India should bring forth. There's to be unnecessarily phobic about China is not the best way forward. There is a natural and there is a geographical reality which we have to accept. But there is enough space and scope for us to do far more on our water resources than we have actually done. So I'll end with this. And thank you for your time and attention. And it will look good to have a few discussions and questions on this.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha, for your excellent exposition and the point that you made that China is using water as a strategic instrument. There are a number of points which have been made by our participants, which we will take up after the second speaker. And there are some observations and some questions. So that will make the discussion more live. And now coming to the second speaker, we have General Kulkarni. Just a brief introduction. General Kulkarni was commissioned into Fort Kumaon in 1977. In his illustrious career of 39 years, he's participated in Operation Polar Bear and Operation Meghdut as a captain in 1983 and in 1984. For leading his platoon to unfurl the national flag on Bila Phongla, he was decorated with Shaurya Chakra. He commanded a Rashtriya Rifle Battalion in the thick of insurgency, and later on, he's been in the Northeast, commanding a battalion, commanding a brigade and a division along the line of actual control. And he's traveled along the great bend that we talk about, Namcha Parwa. So he knows the place better than most of us. And I was also along with him for some time in that region. He's been decorated with the Governor's Gold Medal while he was in Arunachal Pradesh. And he's an alumni of National Institute of Defense Studies in Japan and NDC, New Delhi. And he retired as the Director General of Infantry. Over to General Kulkarni.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Good morning to my distinguished panelists. There's very little that once you have Dr. Sinha say, because he's actually at it, working at it. He's written so much on the Indus Water Treaty. He has totally on hand on what is going on. I'll share with some of it what I've noted down so that I don't really repeat to what Dr. Sinha has already said. And to what General Mahajan said, definitely, as I did get commissioned in 1977, it was a time when just a year before you had Mao Zedong die, and almost the same time, a year later, we had Ziaul Haq take over. In India also, we had the emergency go, and we had all kinds of things happening. So we saw the Chinese at very close quarters, when they would come with, a totally band gala at the borders, keep interacting with them, and they would be looking quite suntanned and different in what I saw of them in 77, 78. And then subsequently again, when I went there as a commanding officer, I saw a totally different this thing, because that was then in 1996 when reforms have taken off in China, and they were now in suited booted, very well turned out. They had their nameplates in Chinese and English, and were almost at all times in the kind of SD dress that we wear in India, in the same color. So there was a drastic change from what we were being taught about the Chinese as sattu eaters or sattu hi khate hain, to a totally different this thing. And every time we had a border personnel meeting with them, it would be they were bringing their packs and everything would be there, and all everything was readily available. And there was a sea change in what the China that I saw of it in 77, 78 to what I saw later as a commanding officer in 1999. And that was the same time when Kargil was going on. So, and then by most of the time was spent thereafter in Arunachal Pradesh, along Subansari, Siom, and Siang. So these are the three valleys that actually went about, and it was very, very interesting there, because having interacted with them in Tawang, and then having done what we call it as the rest of Arunachal Pradesh, going on to the valleys of Subansari, and then you had Siom, Siang. Now all of them become Brahmaputra. So having served there at a time like in 2000, when we had that incidents where we find the river, suddenly Brahmaputra turns dry for some time. Later in 2005, 2006, we saw Brahmaputra suddenly had blackish kind of things coming into the riverbed, and then putting us to seeing as to why this kind of a thing is happening suddenly into Brahmaputra. And then we saw it again in 2001, 2005, 2006, what happened in Himachal Pradesh, wherein then ISRO did take up a case to see as to through their remote sensing satellites and everything as to how is it what happened. And then they realized what the Chinese were doing along the Satluj over there, and what the Chinese subsequently were doing along the this Nama Bechwa. Basically, how I saw it was because while in a place called Tuting, we would go to Kepangla, and from there we would see this Nerma, this peak over there, and that is exactly from where that what they call as the U-turn, the bend, was distinctly visible, though about 30 odd kilometers. But of course, on clear days, it is very, very clearly visible. So that was not a major problem. But as the Chinese are, we realized it that the Tibetan plateau, as what Dr. Sinha will be telling us, is the water repository. And this Tibetan plateau, the Chinese took only about 75 years back. And they did not have any say in the Tibetan plateau, because all along the Chinese weren't actually being ruled by Han except for a short period. So it was the other dynasties that ruled, though the Chinese do take claim that they were all part of them. But Tibetan plateau, the Chinese had no access whatsoever, other than just that, to use the term suzerainty. But definitely neither Tibet was sovereign, and neither did the Chinese have a full say on Tibetan, because they had their own passport, they had their own currency, they were moving all around, and the entire plateau on top of it have rivers which extended right from top, going, if you saw Yangtze, which would go along to Shanghai, and you had Indus, which would come down to the Arabian Sea, and then you have the Brahmaputra, which comes into the Bay of Bengal. So you find three major rivers. I'm not talking about Mekong, I'm not talking about Irrawaddy, I'm not talking about Salween, but the ones which really affect us, which Dr. Sinha was talking about. One is Brahmaputra, and right through as a lower riparian, or the middle one, whichever we would want to call it as. So we found that the Brahmaputra, which went around through us, and Indus, which while in Leh that we served, we saw how it came from the famous place that we're hearing about, Demchok. That's the place where from the Charding Nala, you have this Nala joining the Indus, and from there, from Phukche, you would see this river Indus keep going along. And that is how then finally, when this show Apna Nubra and show go join that at near Skardu, and then that is Indus into Pakistan, which obviously is the most important river for Pakistan, because otherwise they would all be turning dry, because that's the basket, that's the real food basket for it. Now, even if we see the water wars, now the most important why all this really comes up, I thought, was the earlier century was energy. We saw oil as very important factor. And the Chinese said the the Middle East and the Americans are looking at it as the OPEC and trying to control energy. It is water and the rare earth material that is something which the Chinese want to control. And they realized it that in Tibet, there was no dearth of rare earth material, be it lithium, be it uranium, be it gold, be it silver. So much of it was there, and tremendous amount of forest. So all this that the Chinese thought timber, that is basically that they must exploit it and take it from there, which they did. And the river, obviously the water repository, because even in 1938 in Chiang Kai-shek, he used the Yellow River to prevent the Japanese. When the Japanese were invading, he thought he would prevent it. And instead, that Yellow River, when you opened the dikes of the water, it led to about 500,000 Chinese dying, about 500,000 Chinese being displaced. And so there was a lot of destruction caused by the Yellow River within China by what the dikes were opened by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, Li Peng was another PLA officer who wrote as to how water could be utilized as a water bomb and how we could use water as a weapon. So weaponization of water is what impressed the Chinese leadership as to how it could be gone about. The Chinese leadership, rightly brought out, they have brilliant people on top. Now, why do I say that? Chow En-lai has studied in France. Deng Xiaoping has studied abroad. You had Hu Jintao, who's done hydrography and was in charge of Tibet till the rail line came up over there. So even how Deng Xiaoping learnt it from Hu Jintao as to how he used water, how he used the real strength, and that is how he used it then subsequently in the Tiananmen Square. So all this top leadership of China, having studied abroad, having been engineers by profession, know exactly how to go about using what and where. And since they knew Tibet, they had suzerainty, but they did not have the sovereignty, and they did not have much influence on Tibet at a point of time all along till Mao Zedong took over. And then subsequently along that, then they said, since the repository of water is Tibet, and it is going from, can you well imagine, where on to Indus onto the Arabian Sea, where from the same point it is flowing down, going to Shanghai, and from the same middle it is coming down to us in the Bay of Bengal, and the same river flowing to Irrawaddy and going, of course, to Southeast Asia, all along the Mekong Delta. And the Chinese, over years of this thing, have constructed over 80,000 dams along all of them. Of course, the Three Gorges, the biggest so far, in which they spent about $30 billion, which is much more. They spent almost 4 times the more that they had seen it. The kind of railway links that they brought along Tibet, then moving down to Shikatse and all over, and then how permafrost was being used. So the Chinese, much what they have done on Tibet, have actually changed the ecology. But Brahmaputra per se, though the UN seems to feel that about 30% of the water of Brahmaputra comes, and that is dependent on coming from the Tibetan plateau. Whereas we seem to feel that it's about 7 to 10% that actual dependency of water of Brahmaputra comes from China. Rest all of it is in the rain shadow, the precipitation, the water, because it's huge water that rain carries it in the Brahmaputra. But at a time when there's a little dry, that between May and October, sometime during that period, when the Chinese can open the tap and close the tap, should they construct this huge dam, which is not so easy again. General Mahajan will understand what I'm trying to convey now, is the Baglia Dam. We both were in Thatri, and we were posted in Thatri, in Kishtwar, in Doda. When he was there, at that point of time, the Chenab used to be flowing very well. I went subsequently again over there, and what do I find? That the entire Baglia Dam being blocked at Doda, the backwaters were coming right up to Kishtwar and going beyond. And there was a tunnel which used to come from Kishtwar for generating electricity, and this was the water that was there. It had transformed the entire thing. But the water level had gone so high that at Doda it would almost be touching the road. So this is the kind of backwater done. And similarly, when we talk about, you found that the Arunachal Deputy Chief Minister announcing that we would on the Siang be able to construct a dam. Now, if that dam has a 9.5 billion cubic meters of ability to retain water, why is he saying 9.5 billion cubic meters? Because this huge dam that the Chinese wish to undertake on the Brahmaputra or Yarlung Zangbo, what they call it as, would have a retention capacity of about 4.5 billion cubic meters of water. That means this 9.5 billion cubic meters which would come on Siang would be able to absorb this 4.5 billion should the Chinese open the tap and suddenly release the water. And you should not be having the entire Assam and the Arunachal and everybody into deep floods like what they did in Himachal, what they did once in Assam also. So to avoid that, this Siang would have 9.5 billion cubic meters of backwater. Now, this has a lot of resistance from the locals over there. While we are there, we noticed it at numerous times at Siom Valley, in the Siang Valley, because you have Menchuka, you have Along, you have Taksing, you have Tuting, all these major, small places which are of importance are along these valleys. And all of them then this form into Brahmaputra and they keep flowing along with. The generation of electricity on the Siang is much less than what the Chinese would be doing. We would only be having about 11,000 megawatt. The Chinese are having over 60,000 megawatt, like what Dr. Sinha said, because at the Great Bend, at this thing, there's a drop of 2,000 meters over a distance of about 50 kilometers. So that particular thing, and while you are sitting at Kepang La, when you go at a place called Tuting over there, and you stand there, you can see the water that Siang flowing comes up to Pasighat, and then thereafter it joins the Brahmaputra. So there's tremendous amount, but obviously there's a tremendous local resistance also because Arunachal Pradesh, the land is of the society, of the people. So it's very difficult. Now, what we saw, what I saw of Tawang, say about 20 years back, you would only see vehicles which are military vehicles operating, and not many people have cars over there. Today, if you go and visit Tawang, you will probably not see a military vehicle, and you'll only see civil vehicles and not being able to walk on the road at all. Every house has a car in Tawang. Every house has a car. People are so well off because the land, whenever it is acquired for, the money is paid for almost 8 times more to the society. And the money is equally distributed to all of them because it is society which owns that particular land. And I say society is a particular village. So it's in crores that they get the compensation, in which all of them suddenly you find, even if you go to Tawang today, you'll find girls who are breaking stones on the road for the BRO would be coming in Maruti cars. They sit there, they break stones, sit in the Maruti car and go back. You can't imagine. You see the kind of hats that they wear while breaking. You will think, are we in India or where are we? That's the kind. So there's a sea change in Arunachal Pradesh that has taken because of the compensation that the government gives to these villages, which is huge. And that is can be seen in Tawang, it can be seen in Pasighat, it can be seen along all the valley. Quite a few dams have come up in Arunachal Pradesh, primarily to garner, not only because irrigation has its own distinct. There is water stress, that there is no denying the fact, and Asia per se has water stress. The availability of water in Asia is approximately about 3,000 odd cubic meters of water per capita per year. Now, per capita individually is about 3,000. Unlike in Oceania, that is Australia and New Zealand, it's about 30,000. When it comes to North and South America, it's about 20,000 cubic meters per capita. And when it comes to Europe, it's about 9,000. And when it comes to Asia, it's about 3,000. And when it comes to India, it's about 2,000. So we have just about 2,000 cubic meters of water available per capita per India. And that's quite not very, and in this, about 70% of it is irrigation. So irrigation, which again, like what Dr. Sinha was bringing about, this water which is stored, it actually makes the soil saline. We've seen it in Bhakra Nangal. We see all these irrigation, wherever we have taken place, the soil turns saline. And therefore, what Punjab was for wheat suddenly turned into rice, because most of these crops, sugarcane and all of them are water intensive, whether it is for oil seeds or for rice, all water intensive, does help in terms of irrigation, but it does not bring silt. If it is the free flow of water, it brings silt. So it auto fertilization of the soil takes place. But when it is water released, it only brings water, it doesn't bring the silt, and therefore slowly and suddenly the soil starts losing, and then the use of more fertilizers, more chemicals, again leads to further things, and the fishes then are affected. So you have fisheries getting into a little problem because a sizable amount of people. Now, Tibet, per se, the Buddhists are worship. They don't eat fish at all. No Buddhist eats fish. The Chinese eat fish. So this demographic changes that have taken place on the Tibetan plateau, where a sizable amount of Han population has come, has also led to huge thing. The medicinal plants which we have in Tibet, where every plant has its own this thing, and you find whether you go to Bhutan or you go to Sikkim or you are in Arunachal Pradesh, you'll find Buddhist medicine is totally dependent on these plants and these particular herbs over there. Unlike what when this Han population got coming over into Tibet, it led to another problem. Now they started eating fishes. They started killing the wildlife over there. So Namcha Barwa, entire this thing area you found wildlife is disappearing. Entire Tibetan plateau wildlife is disappearing. Plants, timber being cut, so the plant oh God, the fish is being eaten. So it is totally against the Buddhist culture which sustained the Tibetan plateau over the centuries, because the Chinese only came, as I said, only 75 years back. And Hans have actually started occupying in a big way, and the Tibetan autonomous region also further got divided. So I would say the Tibetans per se, in the majority area, it got divided because some portion went over there, some portion went in the Tibetan autonomous region where the Tibetans were again not in majority. You have 3.5 million Tibetans, you have about 3.2 million Hans. So this demographic changes that have taken place and the food habits that have changed led to yet another problem, the electricity generation. Obviously, when the Hans came from the plains, like we were talking about the north and the north is arid. The south isn't of China. And what is the famous place in north is Beijing. And what's the famous place in down south is Shanghai. So you have this water going to Shanghai, a whole lot of it in the south, it is available. Beijing has a problem. Now Beijing and all these areas of the north, because of arid, there's a problem. Even the Yellow River that you see sometimes when I visited there, totally dry. Absolutely dry. Sometimes you feel, how come this huge riverbed, you would say not even a stream flowing from there. So they have a problem, and that problem the Chinese understand, and they have to make sure that there is no water stress. That in any case, because 95% of the population of China is Hans, so they're going to exploit Xinjiang province. They're going to exploit the Tibetan region. So all of it which is flowing from over there. Now, what is very important that we see, and what I saw while at Lika Bali, that's where we were headquartered at, and of course at Along, at Walong, and then at Pasighat, Tuting, Taksing, all the water flow in all of these rivers are absolutely unbelievable, and I doubt very much if the Chinese can ever be able to domesticate and be able to use this water to be able to virtually stop by constructing a dam. They are, of course, investing over $130 billion. I don't know the height because ecologically and geologically, as we've been rightly brought up, earthquakes have already started. And so therefore, even if it's an earthquake of 7.1 on the Richter scale, they've already had few deaths. Although 26 or some people have already died. We have other problems over there. So there is a lot of problem that is cropping up if the Chinese start doing what they're planning to do. Because about 85,000 dams, small ones, big ones, whether it is in terms of the Three Gorges, now this huge, massive dam that is to come up, it is not at all easy to be able to arrest water, to use the arrested water is a very, very difficult thing to do. And I don't know whether the Chinese can actually do it in that manner, but yes, doing and seeing Chinese, if they can't, they'll probably release it. They don't care how many people die downstream in India or Bangladesh die, but there is a problem. There is a problem. But what I saw in Siang and what I saw in Siom, I did notice that was around 2005, 2006, that there was shortage in Brahmaputra, that there was the silt which came. That first gave us an indication that this black silt that is coming, that means some construction work of cement is going upstream. And surely now, of course, this December of 2002 for 25th of December, when the Chinese have said that they're constructing, but the construction is already commenced. There is a huge construction which is going on, smaller dams, not the kind that we are looking at it, but yes, smaller dams are constructed. Now, all these villages which have come up, all these 600 odd villages which have come up, and not necessarily only after Galwan, a little before that, and subsequently build up of these villages which have come up all along the LAC, have beautiful hutments, have communication facilities, have roads, have water, have all, you can see the works for people to stay there comfortably. What does that show? That means they require electricity. They need to generate it over there only. They require good roads. That means all of it is being everything ecologically. There is an imbalance which is being created on the Tibetan plateau, and that imbalance, and resulting from that imbalance, floods which may crop up, or maybe the as I said, the tap control is with China. Whenever they wish to release, what they did it in the Mekong thing. In Mekong Delta, they did the same thing when Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, the Mekong River had almost become a trickle because they were controlling. I am told only along the Salween that the Chinese have not been able to construct any dams, and probably they have not constructed. Dr. Sinha can confirm it to me, because whether they have, because what I understand, along Salween there are no dams and this thing, but all other rivers emanating from the Tibetan plateau, there are huge number of dams which they're able to sort of arrest that water, use it for irrigation, use it for generation of electricity, keep it for the drinking, fresh drinking water, which has a tremendous amount of stress. And in view of it being a water bomb, what they call it as weaponization of water, which the Chinese are capable of. They had attempted first, as I said, in 1938, when the Japanese invasion took place, but they couldn't stop the Japanese from invading China. They did. And subsequently now, once they have got into Tibet in 1950, and the way they have gone all about it in controlling the water which emanates from there, from the Tibetan plateau, I would look at that there is a lot that we need to do. And the only way which we can look at it from the Chinese point of view is, Chinese will always would want anybody on the lower riparian. All this is a way of monitoring, controlling, because the water which is flowing from the is going into the East China Sea, is going into the South China Sea, is going into
I think Gen Kulkarni's thing has been lost, so we will just wait for a minute. Otherwise, till he comes back online, what I will do is I'll take on the questions which have come up in the chat box. I'll just read three of them first, and then I would request Dr. Sinha to join in to answer those. This is from Mr. Shrikant Kulkarni. He says that there is recent news.
Sorry, sir. I think no, this is the
right,
problem.
We'll continue with Gen Kulkarni. Yeah. Please join. Carry on.
Sorry. So I was telling that this particular aspect of the water being controlled by the Chinese, and especially because repository of water, the Tibetan plateau is for fresh drinking water, and that is very, very important, and that can cause stress. And that stress, as the availability per head per capita in India is just about 2,000 cubic meters. And that is very little compared to what we've seen it in Europe or in entire China. China has tremendous stress, as rightly brought out. The northern area, northern China is arid. So in that context, I think this particular huge dam that is coming up, which will of course take a lot of time, will create, I would say, a problem, because not from that point of view, not that we are too much dependent on the Tibetan plateau for Brahmaputra. The dependency as per us is between 7 to 10%. Dependency on it as to the FAO, the UN, is about 30%, which is also not. But very important is, if there are 4.5 billion cubic meters of water stored in a dam, which they can release at a time when we don't want it, or at a time when you have, you can create floods, you can create problems, you have fish, the entire economy, millions and people who are dependent on it suddenly find water come into their houses, or water, the whole area is flooded, and that's all between May and October, because it's run of the water. That means the water is not the water will continue to flow, but once this 4.5 billion cubic meters, and in that context, when Arunachal has just about announced to say that we are now constructing a dam along Siang, which will have a 9.5 billion cubic meters of storage, indicator that we can be able to store or release the water of it stored at the Siang Dam, and then only allow that much of water to flow from there that we require. And the generation of electricity, of course, the Chinese will have always been wanting to generate this electricity because the kind of villages, the 600 plus these vibrant villages and all of these areas are being are dual purpose villages where the PLA and the local civilians and the local police are all wanting to stay together to keep an eye on India. So that is also there. Plus, obviously, a lot of activities are taking place on top of the Tibetan plateau because of the kind of roads that have come up. Excellent roads, unbelievable roads. But to conclude, I can only say that in my entire, what Jal Mahajan said, my 39 years of service in the army, I retired in 2016. I have never ever seen a Chinese helicopter. I have never ever seen a Chinese drone. I have never ever seen a Chinese aircraft come anywhere. And today I understand there's no dearth of Chinese drones that fly. The Chinese helicopters keep flying. Never. Neither in Tawang. I have over 15 years commanded my battalion there, my brigade there, my division there, as Chief of Staff Eastern Command. Never. Never. The Chinese. But today you can now find lovely roads that have come up. Beautiful roads. The roads were always there. I walked on those roads and I found them. There's no denying the fact they can mobilize very, very fast. We were always flying in helicopters. We were always flying all over and wherever we wanted to go. But even if I had to meet the 3-star general at Bumla, I never saw them come or never even heard an helicopter anywhere. He would be somewhere maybe 40, 50 kilometers. They may be coming, landing there, and then driven to Bumla. So that is all it is about. But yes, there is water stress. Yes, the Chinese can create by opening the tap at a time when we don't want them to open the tap. Yes, they're generating electricity. It is an ecological disaster because, like was initially also brought out by Marshal Gokhale, that 0.06 seconds, that complete Earth revolution also is being affected because the water at a particular point of time area has accumulated. With this kind of a huge dam, that is the Three Gorges. Now, this is 3 times more than that. So you can imagine what kind of changes that will take place. And if there are any more questions, we'll take it on later. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jal Kulkarni. We had an excellent account of how things are on ground and how things have changed since the 70s when you first went to Tawang and how things are now. So we'll take on the questions now. This is from Dr. Shrikant Kulkarni, Mr. Shrikant Kulkarni. There is the recent news about India planning a big dam near Parong. Is it a good step? Then there's a remark by IIRF saying very good point about the middle riparian. Then Mr. Kulkarni continues. Also, China is trying to draw pure water from the snow-peaked mountains in Aksai Chin for its chip industry, the industry making the chips. Do we have any such scope? Then ADG Tafekar has said that what is the extent of risk and what are the options before India in case China resorts to weaponizing and using the project as a water bomb. So these 2-3 points which have been made, I would first request Dr. Sinha to answer them, and then if Jal Kulkarni has to say anything. Dr. Sinha, please.
Well, thank you. And this, sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat because of the Delhi pollution factor. But these questions are quite interesting, as much as of great concern as to what the Chinese will do and what they will not do, etc. I think, but before I answer this, there's one point that struck me from General Kulkarni's views, that we often tend to believe that the Chinese are notorious and they don't look left and right when they plan their projects, and tend to ignore the environmental and the ecological consideration. But there has been a societal change in China that we need to reflect upon and maybe use that as an instrument of building our concern level through this particular constituency in the Chinese. And this constituency is, the more ecologically concerned constituency, where local issues and principles are being discussed. even the scientific community of China these days, from time to time, through various platforms, through their writings, are expressing a lot about the dangers and the vulnerabilities of these gigantic projects that the Chinese leaderships are planning. So I think this element of picking on this constituency and building a certain voice of concern could be an effective way of raising concerns with China. I think we should do that. General Kulkarni also mentioned that the river that flows into Myanmar is the only river that has not yet been tapped by the Chinese leadership. Brahmaputra, by the way, is the last of the rivers that is being developed. But the one in Myanmar hasn't been done so. That is because there's been a huge growing protest against sort of intervening in those rivers that flow into Myanmar. So there is an example of a growing Chinese constituency that is concerned about such big projects. Geologists, scientists, climatologists who understand through scientific evidences the dangers involved in these projects. Of course, their voice is not a big voice, it's not an influential voice, but I think it's a voice that can be picked up and built into the risk factors. Also remember that in China, there's a huge hydro dam constituency and lobbyists who work overnight in terms of getting projects. There's a whole lot of money involved, transaction, bribery. So, there is another element of that happening. The lobbyists at work, the lobbyists trying to cut down the coal lobbyists, the coal lobbyists trying to cut down the wind lobbyists. So plenty of lobbyists are at work in China, each trying to influence the leadership into getting their slice of the cake. I think the hydrologists these days are very strong because they use the element of clean energy. Hydro electricity is equivalent to clean energy, and with Chinese objective of reaching net carbon emission by 2060, so the voice has grown stronger. So there is this competition that we must understand within China, within the domestic China. As far as what we can do on some of the questions that has been raised, we can do a lot, as I said, so and I won't really repeat myself. But we must also realize the Chinese are going to be increasingly aggressive on water. And I worry most is that, unfortunately, all the rivers that are coming into our territory are at very sensitive areas. So I think from a military perspective, from a socio-economic perspective, from a political perspective, we need to really factor this thing very, very much into our border strategy. How to develop, water resources, how to build infrastructure. Even in terms of settlement, you can only allow settlement to happen when there is lots of water resources development. You cannot settle people without no water around, or water that does not give you electricity. So our development plan needs to be greater, more holistic in the border section, right from Tibet Haksai-Chin, from Ladakh Haksai-Chin to the Arunachal Pradesh sector. Yes, dam building is an enormously difficult task. It's a politically challenging task. There's a lot of emotion involved. There's issues of displacement. And there's a lot of people concern that comes in. And while it is very easy for us to say we should build more dams, we should have more water footprints in Arunachal Pradesh or in Kashmir, we have to also factor in the challenges of building such structures. Yes, we need water resource, we need storage, and a lot of them as we build our economy and our growth pattern. But how do we do it is something that we have to really consider carefully. For example, site selection would be very important. The size of the water storages would be important. I know the civil engineers in the Central Water Commission don't like small projects. It's not cost effective. But really, we have to think differently. Just by building big structures might not really work out well. Look at the Bhakra Nanga, look at the Hirakud dams after 60 years, 75 years. We are seeing the repercussions of such dams, such structures, and decommissioning can become a very difficult task because all these dams accumulate a lot of silt. And in fact, we need a national siltation policy to accumulate silt from all these dams and then distribute this as fertility of the soil. Anyway, these have to be carefully thought, really. And I think the more and more we involve the people into this process, the farmers, the local settlers, educate, make them aware of the situation. I think that can work well, rather than thrust projects upon them. It will be good to work with the people. Another thing we should be very careful of, and I've been saying this, that we should not create in India an upstream, downstream equivalence of what we have with the Chinese. Remember, if there's going to be concerns with Assam over what we are doing in Arunachal Pradesh, this is something that we need to then factor in very carefully, because that will be the perfect thing for the Chinese to see us managing our own upstream, downstream equations with our provincial states. Water is a state subject, of course, but when it comes to national projects, there has to be a greater involvement of center, more sensitivity when we pick our projects, a greater involvement of stakeholders, and in the case of Arunachal Pradesh, there has to be an equal dialogue with Assam. So it requires a really different kind of a planning process now. Not just building dams, but building dams holistically and taking in the concerns of different stakeholders.
Okay, Gen Kulkarni, you have any further comments on these issues which have been raised?
So to what Dr. Sinha has said, I'm reminded of a small joke. These people over there would keep saying, ये जो पानी आजकल आता है ना, इसमें दम नहीं है, इसमें बिजली निकाल दी है, ये पानी में दम नहीं है. It is not बिजली, पानी से बिजली निकाल दिया. The problem is the earlier water which came and the rainwater had silt. Now the water that is being given as part of irrigation is pure drinking water which goes. Obviously it has nothing. So the fertility of the soil is not there. As a result of it, the farmers and the people start feeling that the water now has got doesn't have that kind of strength, or to be able to, because the production of grain per acre has reduced. The second thing is, like in Pasighat, obviously people have now started protesting, and so on, say Siang Valley, they said we have our orange cultivation, and that orange cultivation, fruit cultivation that is taking place, where the entire area will now undergo this thing completely underwater. They get about 3 lakhs per year from these fruit cultivation. So they are insisting that, okay, even if we were to take our land, we need money as compensation. So the government has to think out, and even the resettling of these people, the Three Gorges unsettled 1.4 million people. Some say even 2 million, much more than that. But official figure is 1.4 million people displaced in Three Gorges. Similar displacement will be there once there. Though, of course, the area of Arunachal Pradesh, you don't have much of density of population. Fortunately, is little less than what it is elsewhere. But despite that, there is going to be this thing, sir. The only thing, this thing that I have noticed in this particular thing is, we really don't have to worry, sir. This Brahmaputra thing is nothing very much to worry about. As I said, our own research does say that only 10% of the water, but yes, we have to ensure that the silt and all of it, which the Chinese might want to sort of play around with, we have to be careful that they do not release it. It shouldn't be like a tap or a huge tank that they have. Open the tap whenever they want it. And this Siang project which comes up, which hopefully should come up, that should be a great relief to the people of Arunachal Pradesh and also of Assam and also of Bangladesh subsequently, because we would be able to take on that water in our own storage and then release whatever little we wanted. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll just go to the last set of questions because we are running short of time. Some of it has already been answered by the speakers earlier, but I'll still read out the questions. This is from Air Commodore Mehrotra. It says, any discrete plans of storage of seasonal flood waters throughout the country? Then Group Captain Purohit has asked, recently local protests erupted in Arunachal Pradesh against the Siang multipurpose project. Your suggestions how these issues can be addressed? And ADG Safikar has raised the issue, and it says, if building a large dam downstream to absorb sudden influx of water from Chinese side is seen as an option, what about viability in terms of cost? $137 billion is more than India's total capital outlay for infrastructure. And Group Captain Purohit said that China's peak carbon emission target is 2030. Is the super dam related to this aspect and efforts to increase China's power generation through hydropower from the present 15%? Mr. Chaudhary has said that out of our one of our veteran pilots has proposed Garland Canal scheme long time back. I read about the scheme in the late 70s. It proposes, the canals and rivers being joined. So this might meet our national demand and even the transportation through the canal, basically talking about the Garland project.
Yeah.
So these are the set of questions. Some have already been answered, but I'll ask your comments for the remaining issues. First from Dr. Sinha and later from Gen Kulkarni.
Yes, I think increasingly the world will encounter a lot of water challenges in terms of how to utilize it, how to distribute it. There's no substitute for water. So the world has to live with this water. You can have a substitute for oil. You can discover new oil wells, but you can't really discover water. So you have to live and manage with the amount of water that you have. And we exactly know now how much water we have. Now, the point is, how do we conserve it, store it, efficiently use it? Storage is going to be an issue. How are we going to store water in the future is something that has to be taken up at the national level. It has to be geographically factored. The peninsula India, the western part of India, the northeast part of India, and river linking becomes also part of that process of how we shift water from one end to another end. I think both China and India, given their size and given the uneven distribution of water, I think it becomes a natural engineering way forward. Any engineer will simply say, well, there's a lot of water at one end and there's less water at another end. And therefore, through engineering means and mechanism, we can shift water. And the shifting of water is what the Chinese have been doing for the last 75 years. And it's something that we have also thought about in terms of our distribution of water. Now, how much will that be successful? Is something that the planning process and the planners are looking at. There are several considerations that one has to take into account. Planning process these days are not, thrust upon, as I said. There are lots of ministries, lots of interdisciplinary approaches. There's a media. There's a legal system which is becoming increasingly environmental conscious. There are n number of litigation that comes in. So through all this, one has to wade through and see what is the best outcome. Now, there are about 30 river linking projects across India. I do not see all of them coming through. What will come through is what can be done as a cost benefit sort of analysis. And there, I think ecological consideration, forest consideration, local people's consideration, it all will be taken into account. All these projects will have to be evaluated carefully. Nowadays, the Ministry of Environment or the Climate Change Ministry is a very powerful ministry in any, sort of projects that we undertake. And as I said, the judicial system is quite awakened to many of such issues. So one has to contend with all this as well. So there's not going to be any blind approach to development of water projects. So in the meantime, what is best to be done is to, for example, recharge our groundwater situation. India is the biggest user of groundwater in the world. And there's been some mapping and assessment done, again, by the Jal Shakti Ministry. And, about 60% of our groundwater resources are in a state of depletion. So you can imagine the kind of crisis it's going to create. And here, I think we need to also, because groundwater is your natural storage capacity. At the surface, you're looking at constructing dams, but here you have a natural storage capacity and you need to recharge that. So recharging is something that has to be focused upon, so that we become far more self-reliant rather than be completely destroyed by the less amount of groundwater. Another thing is how we use water in the agricultural sector. India has one of the largest water use for agriculture in the world. 75% of the water is used for irrigation and agriculture. As I said, the Chinese are gradually reducing their water intake in the agricultural sector. From as high as 62%, now it's coming down to 50 to 48% as they move forward. So the water is shifting there in the industrial and manufacturing sector. Now in India, as we also move on this economic trajectory, we have to focus a lot on the manufacturing sector. In the manufacturing sector, we have about 12 to 13% of water distribution there. That has to be increased. Now, would that mean you reduce your agricultural water intake? Probably yes. Where do you get your water from, right? To reduce your water intake in the agricultural sector, you have to start looking at efficient way of doing agricultural production, efficient water management, less crops which have less use of water, shifting to probably millets as a more resilient crop, moving away from the earlier pattern of food production. I think these are all factors that need to be calculated into our water policies. Of course, there is a strong external dimension that comes from China, but there is also a very important internal dimension also that we need to factor in into our water process, into our water policies. And remember, water is a state subject. It's a highly political, emotional, and divisive subject. States contend, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. In fact, there's been less contestation and there's been more transparency and dialogue interstate than there has been intrastate in India. That's another one of the ironies of water issues in India, that there's been more law and order issues and deaths related to water distribution within India than it has been between countries that have water issues with India. So these are issues, and there will be a huge challenge that we have to deal with. Water is the most central feature of any planning process. You take away water from it and everything collapses. So, and there is this great nexus of food, energy, and water developing. And with climate change, challenges that it has, we'll have to seriously study all these elements into our policy making and planning processes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sinha. Gen Kulkarni, you have any remarks?
So just about 2-3 points is covered all very well. First and foremost, these huge dam which the Chinese are looking at it, keeping in view the international reaction, they've already started saying it's a clean green dam, so that there is no protest coming, and as they wish to become carbon neutral, so they're looking at it from that point of view. And some of the inland waterways, the Chinese have utilized, say, in Three Gorges, 630 kilometers of inland waterways, and therefore even oceanic vehicle, the ships ply on that particular thing. So they use for all of that. As regards the local protests are concerned, of course, there is no denying the fact the local protests are there. As regards the Indian investment is concerned, to counter the Chinese investment of over $137 billion, we have $17.5 billion project that is being apportioned for Siang. 17.5, because they are not generating electricity to the extent that the Chinese are doing. Chinese are doing about 60,000 megawatts, while ours is 11,000 megawatts. But because of the storage, basically to ensure that Chinese do not use water as a weapon, and it's not a water bomb that we're always scared about being in the lower riparian. Otherwise, and the Chinese also intend transferring water from south to the north, so for which they are constructing underground tunnels, maybe about 20-30 kilometers, not 1 or 2, 4 or tunnels of this kind, only to ensure that the water from south is transferred to north, which is a more arid land, and therefore the Han population at any point of time don't feel the water stress. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Gen Kulkarni. Now we'll have only one question, that is from Rishi Atreya. Please ask your question, and I would request Dr. Sinha to answer it. We are running out of short of time, so this will be the last question. Please. You are muted, Rishi. You are muted.
Sorry. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you very much. Very enlightening discussion.
and we learn a lot. You see, I put 2 links in the chat box about our book, and we have chapters on water and infrastructure. So I'd say they are worth reading. I mean, our General Mahajan is familiar with the book, so the authors are also good experts. So all I'd say is I'd request on merits consider reading these chapters.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's very useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rishi. And it is for me to thank both the speakers. I would thank Dr. Sinha for his excellent analysis of the Super Dam project. And 2-3 points which he highlighted, I just want to repeat them, that the cost is enormous. $137 billion and 2.5 times the size of the Three Gorges Dam. And what is the objective? The China's objective is to get India worried. And is this dam really possible? Because it is being constructed in the most difficult area, most ecological sensitive area where a lot of earthquakes may take place. So really, will it be possible? How many years will it take? These are the questions, which come up in our mind. And he mentioned that, we are only talking about Yarlung Zangbo River. But what about Indus and Satluj? We need to think about that also and how this is to be managed. And another important issue which you mentioned is water and territory are interlinked. Very, very important. We only talk about territory, but we are forgetting about water, which is one of the most important resources. And he's mentioned about various options which are available to us, that we require a whole of nation approach. We should tap the inland water capacity, inland water transport capacity. Dialogue is essential. Keeping quiet is of no issue. And water should be one of the core issues in any of the dialogue with the Chinese. And we'd get the low riparians together to have a louder voice in this. And he's spoken about the Ganga-Mekong cooperation, which we had earlier. Gen Kulkarni highlighted his experiences on the ground and how the Chinese have changed from 1977 to 2000, how the development has taken place, and how it affects all these projects. How the locals are now, both on the Chinese side as well as Indian side, are waking up and protesting against the government for these projects. And how China has controlled the Tibet water. He did not have the control initially, but now it has got full control of the water in Tibet. And how initially it had only thought of controlling on the rare earths, and now it is thinking of controlling the water also. And how it is planning to weaponize this important resource. And he mentioned about how the Siang Dam will be able to store water and address this issue about the weaponization to some extent. 2 points which again Dr. Sinha highlighted later is about national siltation policy, which we really haven't got one. Another one is about the groundwater recharge. We only think about constructing dams to store water, but groundwater recharge is also another issue that we must think of. So I must thank both the speakers for their participation and sparing their valuable time. And also I must thank the audience who are very active and asked very pertinent questions, and we had to stop them because of shortage of time. So thank you all very much. Jai Hind. I'll stop the recording now. Jai Hind, and you may log out.
Thank you.
Jai
Good
Hind.
luck.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Good luck.
Bye,
All the
Shashi.
best.
Thanks, sir. Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was very, very informative, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all.